The Count's Chauffeur, a series of complete stories by William Le Queux. Number 1. A Move on the 40. In Paris and Rome and Florence and Berlin and Vienna, in fact over half of the face of empire, from the Pyrenees to the Russian frontier, I am now known as the Count's Chauffeur. An Englishman, as my name, George Awart, denotes, I am of the cosmopolitan birth and education, and early youth being spent in the continent, where my father was an agent in the London firm. When I was 14, my father, having prospered, came to England and established himself as an agent in Wood Street, City, representing a great firm of silk manufacturers in Lyons. At 20, I tried city life, but an office with a high stool and a dusty ledger and sandwich lunches had no attraction for me. I had always had a turn for mechanics, but was never allowed to adopt engineering as a profession, my father's one idea being that I should follow in his footsteps, a delusive hope entertained by many a fond parent. 6 months of office life sufficed me. One day I went home to Teddington and refused to return to Wood Street, and this resulted in an open quarrel between my father and myself. With the result that a week later I was on my way to Canada. In a year I was back again, and after some months of semi-starvation in London, I managed to obtain a job in a motor factory. I was then entirely in my element. During 2 years I learned the mechanism for the various petrol-driven cars, until I became classed as an expert driver and engineer. Where I was employed, there was manufactured one of the best and most expensive makes of English car, and being at length placed on the testing staff, it was my duty to take out each new chassis for its trial run before being delivered to a customer. Upon my certificate, each chassis was declared in perfect running order, and was then handed over to the body makers indicated by the purchaser. Being an expert driver, my firm sent me to drive in the tourist trophy races on the Isle of Man, and I likewise did the Andreas circuit, and came in fourth in Brescia race for the Florio Cup in my successes, of course adding glory and advertisement to the car I drove. Racing, however, aroused within me, as it does in most motorists, an ardent desire to travel long distances. The testing of those chassis in Regent Park, and the occasional run with some wealthy customer out of the Great North Road or the Bath and Brighton roads, became too quiet a life for me. I was now seized by a desire to tour and see Europe. True, in my capacity as a tester, I met all classes of men. In the seat beside me have had cabinet ministers, dukes, Indian Rajas, members of parliament, and merchant princes, customers or prospective purchasers, all of whom chatted with me, mostly displaying their ignorance of the first principles of mechanics. It was all pleasant enough, a merry life and good pay, yet I hated London, and the height of my ambition was a good car to drive abroad. After some months of waiting, the opportunity came and I seized it. By appointment at the Automobile Club one grey December morning, I met Count Bindo de Ferris, a young Italian aristocrat whose aspect, however, was the reverse of a southerner. About 30, he was tall, lithe, and well-dressed in dark brown lounge suit. His complexion, his chestnut hair, his erect, rather soldiering bearing, his clean-shaven face, and his open countenance gave him the appearance of an English gentleman. Indeed, I took him at first for an Englishman, for he spoke English perfectly. When he had examined my testimonials and made a number of inquiries, he asked, "You speak French?" "Yes," was my reply, "a little Italian and a little German." "Italian!" he exclaimed in surprise. "Excellent!" Then, while we sat alone, with no one in hearing, He told me the terms upon which he was willing to engage me to drive on the continent, and added, "Your salary will be doubled, providing I find you entirely loyal to me. That is to say, you must know how to keep your mouth closed. Understand?" And he regarded me rather curiously as I thought. "No," I don't quite understand." "Oh, well, there are matters, private family matters, of which you will probably become cognizant. Truth to tell, I want help. The help of a good, careful driver who isn't afraid and who is always discreet. I may as well tell you that before I wrote to you, I made certain inquiries regarding you, and I feel confident that you can serve me very much in our mutual agreement." This puzzled me, and my curiosity was further aroused when he added, "To be plain, there's a certain young lady in a very high society in the case. I need not tell you more, need I? You will be discreet, right?" I smiled and promised. What did it mean? I wondered. My employer was mysterious, but in due course I should, as he had prophesied, obtain knowledge of a secret love affair, no doubt. The Count's private affairs did not, after all, concern me. My duty was to drive on the continent, and for that he was going to pay me as I serve him loyally, and see that his tire and petrol bills were not too exorbitant. He went to the writing table and wrote out a short agreement, which he copied, and we both signed it. A rather curiously worded agreement by which I was to serve him for 3 years, and during that time our interests were to be mutual. That last phrase caused me to wonder, but I scribbled my name and refrained from comment, for the payment was already double that which I was receiving from the firm. "My car is outside," he remarked, as he folded his copy of the agreement and placed it in his pocket. "Did you notice it?" I had not, so we went out to the Piccadilly together, and there, standing in the curb, I saw a car that caused my heart to bound with delight. A magnificent 6-cylinder, 40-horsepower Napier of the latest model. The car was open, with a side entrance, and dark green body with coronets and cipher on the panels, upholstered in red, with glass removable screen on the splashboard, a splendid workmanlike car just suitable for long tours and fast runs. Of all the cars and of all the makes, that was the only one which it was my ambition to drive. I walked around it with admiration, and saw that every accessory was best and the very latest that money could buy, even to the newly invented gas generator which had only a few weeks ago been placed upon the market. I lifted the long bonnet and looked around the engine and saw those 6 cylinders in a row, the latest invention of a celebrated inventor. "Splendid!" I ejaculated. "There's nothing yet to beat this car. By Jove, can we get a move on a good road?" "Yes," smiled the Count. "My man Mario could make her travel, but he's a fool and has left me in a fit of temper. He was an Italian, and we Italians are, alas, hot-headed." And he laughed again. "Would you like to try her?" I assented with delight, and while he returned inside the club to get his fur coat, I started the engine and got in the steering wheel. A few moments later, he placed himself beside me, and we glided down Piccadilly on our way to Regent's Park, the ground where here, day after day, it had been my habit to go testing. The car ran perfectly. The engine sounded in a splendid rhythm through the Regent Street traffic into the broad Portland Place, and onto the park, where I was afforded some scope to see what she could do. The Count declared that he was in no hurry, therefore he went up through Hampstead to the Highgate station, and then to the Great North Road, through East End, Whetstone, Barnet, and Hatfield to Hitchin, 35 miles of road, which was well known to me as the Strand. The morning was dry and cold, the roads in excellent condition bar a few patches of new metal between the Conduit and Chapelfoot, and the sharp east wind compelled us to goggle. Unfortunately, I had my leather-lined frieze coat, and was therefore fully equipped. The north road between London and Hitchin is really of little use for trying to speed a car, for there are so many corners. It is mostly narrow, and it abounds in police traps. At 20 miles of flat, straight road with perfect surface from Lincoln to New Holland, opposite Hull, is one of the best places in England to see what a car is worth. Nevertheless, the run to Hitchin satisfied me perfectly that the car was not a roundabout, as so many are, but a car well within the meaning of the act. "And what is your opinion of her, Ewart?" asked the Count, as we sat down in the cold beef and pickles for a long old-fashioned upstairs room in the Sun Inn at Hitchin. "Couldn't be better," I declared. "The brake would do all the relining, but that's about it. When do we start for the continent?" "The day after tomorrow. I'm staying just now in the Cecil. We'll run the car down to Folkestone and ship her across, then go by Paris and Aix to Monte Carlo. Afterwards, we'll decide upon our itinerary. Ever been to Monte?" I replied in the negative. The prospect of going on the Riviera sounded delightful. After our late luncheon, we ran back to the Hitchin to London, but not arriving before lighting up in time, we had to turn on the headlights beyond Barnet. We drove straight to the fine garage in the embankment beneath the Cecil, and after I had put things square and received orders for 10 o'clock next day, I was preparing to go to my lodgings in Bloomsbury to look through my kits in preparation for the journey, when my employer suddenly exclaimed, "Come up to my smoking room at this moment. I want to write a letter for you to take to Boodle's in St. James Street for me, if you will." I followed him upstairs to the great and tiled smoking room overlooking the embankment, and as we entered, two well-dressed men, Englishmen, from a Christiatic bearing, rose from a table and shook him warmly by the hand. I noticed their quick, apprehensive look as they glanced at me through the inquiry, but my employer exclaimed, "This is my new chauffeur, Ewart, an expert. Ewart, these are my friends, Sir Charles Blythe," indicating the elder man, "and Mr. Henderson. The gentlemen will always be with us sometimes, so you had better know their names." The pair looked me up and down and smiled pleasantly. Sir Charles was narrow-faced, about 50, with a dark beard turning grey. His companion was under 30, a fair-haired, rather foppishly dressed young fellow, in a fashionable suit and a light, fancy vest. Then, as the Count went to the table to write, Sir Charles inquired where we had been, and whether I had driven much in the Continent. When the Count handed me the letter, I saw that he exchanged a meaningful glance at Sir Charles, and what it was intended to convey, I could not guess. I only know that, for a few seconds, I felt some vague distrust of my new friends, and yet they treated me more equal than as a mere chauffeur. The Count's friends were certainly a merry, easy-going pair, yet somehow I instinctively held them in suspicion. Whether it was on account of the covert glance of Sir Charles shot across my employer, or whether there was something unusual in their manner, I cannot tell. I am only aware that when I left the hotel, I went on my way in wonder. The next day, at 10 punctually, I ran the car to the Strand to the courtyard up of the hotel and pulled up at the restaurant entrance, so as to be out of the way of the continuous cab traffic. The Count, however, did not make his appearance until nearly half an hour later, and when he did arrive, he superintended the dispatch by cab of a quantity of luggage, which he told me he was sending forward by Grand Vaiselle to Monte Carlo. After the four-wheeler had moved off, the hail porter helped him on with his big fur coat, and he, getting up beside me, told me to drive to Piccadilly. As we were crossing the Trafalgar Square and Pall Mall, he turned to me, saying, "Remember, Ewart, your promise yesterday. If you think I'm a little peculiar at times, don't trouble your head about it. You are paid to drive, and paid well, I think. My affairs don't concern you, do they?" "Not in the least," I answered, nevertheless puzzled. He descended from the tobacconist's in Bond Street and bought a couple of boxes of cigars, and made several calls at shops, also visiting 2 jewelers to obtain, he remarked, a silver photograph frame of a certain size. At Gilling's, the third shop he tried, he remained inside for some time, yet quite 20 minutes, I would think. As you know, it is the narrowest part of Bond Street, and the traffic was congested owing to the road to Piccadilly End being particularly up. As I sat in my place, staring idly before me, and reflecting that I should soon be traveling due south of the road, well-kept French roads, and out of the gloom and dreariness of the England winter, I suddenly became conscious of a familiar face in the crowd of hurrying foot-passengers. I glanced up quickly as a man bustled past. Was I mistaken? I probably had been, but the thin, keen-bearded countenance was very much like that of Sir Charles Blythe. But no, when I looked back after him, I saw this figure was much more bent, and his appearance not half so smart and well-groomed as the Count's friend. At a moment I felt absolutely positive that the man had really been watching me, and now endeavoring to escape recognition, yet at the next I saw the absurdity of such a thought. Sir Charles's face had, I suppose, been impressed upon my memory by the previous evening, and the passer-by merely bore some slight resemblance. And so I dismissed it from my mind. A few moments later, a man in a frock coat, probably the jeweler's manager, opened the door, looked up and down the street for a few minutes, shot an inquisitive glance at me, and then disappeared within. I found that the clock of the splashboard required winding, and was in the act of doing so when my eyes fell upon a second person who was equally mysterious. This time I felt convinced that I was not mistaken. The fair-moustached young man Henderson went by, without recognizing me. Either did he recognize the car. If so, what objects they had not to acknowledging me? My suspicions were again aroused. I did not like either of the 2 men. Were they following my master with some evil intent? In London, and especially certain cosmopolitan cities, one cannot be too cautious regarding one's acquaintances. They had been slightly too overdressed and too familiar with the Count to suit me, and I had resolved that if I had ever to drive either of them, I would land them in some out-of-the-world hole with a pretended breakdown. The non-motorist is always at the mercy of their chauffeur, and the so-called breakdowns are frequent due to the vengeance of the driver, who gets his throttle stuck in some trouble which sounds equally serious, but which are remedied according to how long the chauffeur decides to take his victim on the road. I wondered, as I sat ruminating, whether these 2 men were really crooks, or so deep-rooted were my suspicions that I decided, when the Count returned, to drop him a hint that we were being watched. I am not nervous by any means, and, moreover, I always carry my own protection, a little handy revolver. Yet I admit that at the moment I felt a decidedly uncomfortable feeling creeping over me. These men meant mischief, and I detected it in their eyes in the previous night. By some kind of mysterious intuition, I became aware that they were in peril. Almost at the moment, the shop door was opened by the manager, and the Count, emerging, crossed to me and said, "Go into the shop, Ewart, and wait there until I return. I'm going around to get some money," and seeing a boy passing, he called him, and saying, "Just mind this car for 10 minutes, my boy, and I'll give you half-a-crown. Never mind the police if they say anything. Tell them I'll be back in 10 minutes. The lad, eager to earn a trifle, at once consented, and descending, I entered the shop, the door of which was still being held open for me, while the Count hailed a hansom and drove away. The shop is one of the finest in Bond Street, and as you know. At that moment there were, however, no other customers. The manager politely invited me to invite having a seat. His lordship will only be a short time, and then, standing with his hands behind his back, he commenced to chat with me. "That's a very fine car of yours," he said. "You ought to be able to travel pretty fast, eh?" "Well, we do, as a matter of fact," I replied. Then he went to the door and, looking over the panes of frosted glass, asked what the horsepower was, and a number of other questions which non-motorists always. Then, returning to me, he remarked that a very nice gentleman his lordship was, and adding that he had been a customer on several occasions. "Have you been long in his service?" he inquired. "Oh, yes," I replied, determined not to be a thought as a new hand. "Quite long time. As you say, he is a very charming man. He's very wealthy, according to the report. I read something about him in the papers the other day, a gift of some thousands to a hospital fund." This rather surprised me. I never remembered having seen the name of Count Bimbo de Ferraris in the papers. Presently I got up and, wandering about the shop, inspected some of the beautiful jewels in the fine showcases, many of them ornaments of enormous value. The manager, a pleasant elderly man, took me around and showed me some of the most beautiful jewelry I had ever seen. Then, excusing himself, he retired to the office beyond the shop, and left me to chat with one of his assistants. I looked at the clock and saw that nearly half an hour had elapsed since the count had left. The constable had looked and inquired about the car, but I assured him that in a few minutes we should be off, and begged, as a favor, that it might be allowed to remain until my master's return. Another quarter of an hour elapsed when the door opened, and there entered two respectably dressed men in dark overcoats, one wearing a soft brown felt hat, and the other a bowler. They asked to see the manager, and the assistant who had been chatting to me conducted them through the shop to the office beyond. Both men were of middle age and well set up, and as they entered I saw a third man, much younger, was with them. He, however, did not come in and stood in the doorway, idly glancing up and down Bond Street. Within the office I distinctly heard the manager utter an exclamation of surprise, and then one of the men, in a deep, low voice, seemed to enter into a long explanation. Then the elder of the two strangers walked along the shop to the door, and, going outside, spoke some words to the man who had accompanied them. On re-entering, he passed me, giving me a sharp glance, and then disappearing again into the office, where, for 5 minutes or so, remained closeted with the manager. Presently, the last-named man came out, and as he approached me I noticed an entire change in his manner. He was pale, almost to the lips. "Will you step into my office for a moment?" he asked. "There's, a little matter of which I want you to speak with you." This surprised me. What could he mean? Nevertheless, I consented, and in a few moments I found myself in a large, well-lit office with the manager and the two strangers. The man in the brown felt hat was the first to speak. "We want to ask you a question or two," he said. "Do you recognize this?" And he produced a small square photograph with a man upon whose coat was a white ticket, bearing a bold number. It started when my eyes fell upon it. "My master," I ejaculated. The portrait was a police photograph, and these men were detectives. The inspector, for such as he was, turned to the jeweler's manager and regarded him with a significant look. "It's a good job we've arrested him with the stuff on him," he remarked. "Otherwise you'd have had his color over again. He's working the same dodge in Rome and Berlin, and both times got clear away. I suppose he came a small customer in order to inspire confidence, eh?" "Well, he came in this morning saying that he wished to give his wife a tiara for the anniversary of their wedding, and asked me if he might have two on approval, as he was decided which to choose, and wished her to pick for herself. He left his car as chauffeur here until his return, and took away two worth £5,000 each. I, of course, did not have the slightest suspicion. Lord Inkswell, the name by which we know him, is reputed everywhere to be one of the richest peers in the kingdom." "Yes, but you see, Detective Sergeant Ardwell here chanced to have him come out to the shop, and recognizing him as a jewel thief, we've wanted for some months and followed his cab to Charing Cross Station, and there arrested him and brought him to Bow Street." I stood, utterly dumbfounded at the sudden ending of what I believed to be an ideal engagement. "What's your name?" inquired the inspector. George Ewart, was my answer. I only entered the Count's service yesterday. And yet you told me you had been the chauffeur a long time, exclaimed the jeweler's master. Well, said the elder to the detectives, we shall arrest you at any rate. You must come round to Bow Street, and I warn you that any statement you may make will be taken down and used in evidence against you. Arrest me, I cried. Why, I haven't done anything. I'm perfectly innocent. I had no idea that... Well, you have more than an idea now, haven't you? Thought the detectives. But come along. We have no time to lose. And he asked the manager to order a four-wheeled cab. I remonstrated in indignation, but to no avail. What about the car? I asked anxiously as we went outside together and stepped into the cab. A third police officer, who had been on guard outside, holding the door, while the constable, who had been worrying me about the car, stood looking on. Diplock, you can drive the motor car, exclaimed the inspector, turning to the detective at the cab door. Just bring that round to Bow Street as quick as you can. The constable took in the situation at a glance. He saw that I had been arrested and asked the detectives if they needed any assistance. But the reply was negative, and with the inspector at my side, the sergeant opposite, we moved to Piccadilly, the jeweler's manager having been requested to attend the Bow Street police station in an hour, in order to identify the stolen property. By that time the charge would be made out, and we should, the inspector said, be up for the magistrate for remand when the court rose. As we drove along Piccadilly, my heart fell within me. All my dreams of those splendid, well-kept roads in the sunny south, and the touring of the greyest places in the continent, and seeing all that was to be seen, had now shattered in a single blow. And what a blow! I had awakened to find myself under arrest as an accomplice of one of the most expert jewel thieves in Europe. My companions were not communicative. Why should they have been? Suddenly I became aware of the fact that we had driven a considerable distance. In my agitated state of mind, I had taken no notice of our route, and my captors had, it seemed, endeavored to take any attention off the direction we had taken. Collecting my scattered senses, however, I recollected that we had crossed one of the bridges over the Thames, and looking out the window, I found that we were in a long, open road of private houses, each with a short strip of railed-off garden in front, South London thoroughfare, evidently. This isn't the way to Bow Street, I exclaimed in wonder. Well, we're not exactly going a straight way, grinned the inspector. Roundabout road, you can call it. I was puzzled. The more when I recognized a few moments later that we'd come down to Camberwell New Road and were passing Camberwell Green. We continued up Denmark Hill until at the corner where Campden Hill branches off, the inspector called to the cabman to stop, and we all descended, and the great detective sergeant paying the fare. Where were they taking me, I wondered. I asked, but they only laughed and would vouchsafe no reply. Together we walked up the quiet semi-rural Champion Hill until we reached Green Lane, when at a sharp right angle of the road as we turned, I saw before me an object which caused me to hold my breath in utter amazement. The car was standing there, right before me in the lonely suburban road, and in it, seated at the wheel, the man whom I had next second recognized as Count himself. He was evidently awaiting me. He was wearing a different motor coat that bore a different number, and as I approached, he noticed that the coronets of cipher had been obliterated by a dab of green paint. "Come on, Edwards!" cried the Count, jumping down to allow me to take his place at steering. I turned to my captors in wonder. "Yes, away with you, Edwards," said the inspector, "and good luck to you." Without another second's delay, I sprang upon the car, and while the Count, as he jumped by my side, shouted goodbye to my captors, and started away towards Lordship Lane in this open county of Surrey. "Where shall we go?" I inquired breathlessly, utterly amazed at our extraordinary escape. "Straight on through Sydenham, and then I'll tell you. The sooner we're out of this, the better. We'll run along to Winchester, where I have a little house in Kingsworthy, just outside the city, and where we can lie low a bit more comfortably." But shan't we be followed by these men? I asked apprehensively. Followed by them? Oh dear, no, he laughed. Of course you don't understand, Edwards. They're all three belong to us. We played the smartish game upon the jeweler, haven't we? They had to frighten you, of course, because it added a real good touch of truth to the scheme. We ought to be able to slip away across the channel in a week's time at latest. They'll leave tonight, in search of me. And he laughed lightly to himself. Then they were not detectives, I exclaimed, utterly staggered by the marvelous ingenuity of the robbery. No more than you are, Ewarts, was his reply. But don't bother your head about it now. All you've got to look forward is your driving. Let's get across to Winchester as quickly as possible. Just here, take a sharp right and the first that takes us left to the Guildwood Road. Then we can move.